Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan show. Thanks for joining the conversation. Hello, Dr. Mark Cheng.
Hello, Sifu Mimi Chan. Good to see
All
you
right.
again.
Enough with the formalities. I think by now our listeners know like we are pals in the podcast sphere as well as outside of that sphere. So yes, always nice to see you, Mark.
Likewise. Likewise.
Mhm. So, how are things over in California? Is it as hot as it is here in Florida? Because we are melting, like
We're lucky
melting.
right now, actually, in the LA-ish area. It's not been crazy hot yet.
Okay.
So yeah, unlike some past summers where there's been triple digits, like scald your feet walking to the mailbox kind of hot, it hasn't hit that hot here yet.
Okay.
And I hope it doesn't.
Yeah, I was always concerned as well. I spoke to one of my friends in the New York and in the Toronto, Canada area when they were having all of that smoke and the haze and the fire. And someone's like, "Oh, I'm from California, kind of used to having that smell all the time," or something like it's this almost constant state of fire. But how have things been this year?
Luckily, so far, at least around me and through most of the greater LA area, there haven't been the same kinds of wildfires as there have been in the past.
Nice.
Now, granted, it's still June as of this recording, so who knows? Like, get us through maybe like October, and if we can dodge that bullet, that'd be wonderful. The problem is that after a winter that has been rather rain heavy, usually there are a lot more blooms. So because there's more blooming of the wild grasses and the wild plants, when it gets hotter, those things all turn into like a tinder box. So like it'll be interesting to see how good people have been, how diligent people have been as far as brush clearance, and what
Mm.
happens as far as the fire season.
Yeah. Well, I wish you the best of luck in that. But in the meantime, we will just keep trying to stay cool through the summer. It is pretty brutal and I'm a little concerned. But I reached out to you probably a couple months ago now, not even weeks, right? I mean, I kind of if listeners don't know, like pretty much I text with Mark like on the daily. Like I get
Hmm.
updates, I get advice. I don't feel shy at all about asking about, oh, hey, I'm feeling this thing in my hip or whatever. And you're always so gracious to be helpful. But it was funny because my massage therapist is always like, "Oh, have you ever had this before? Have you had cupping?" I'm like, "Well, I have cups here." Actually, she goes, "Really?" And she was so excited because she's like, "I've never had a client that has cups." So I was like, "Well, you don't ask that well yet, but you will." But he has every tool there is, every little, anything to do with fitness or wellness and stuff, except, some of the amazing things you have at your house. But I always found it interesting how some of these traditional Chinese medicine tools are kind of more popularized now, a little bit more mainstream, because my massage therapist is not of Asian descent, but really, really loves it. And she actually asked about guasha. And I was like, is that with the scraping? And she goes, yeah. I go, well, I have had it, but when I did, I shared the story. I was maybe in kindergarten, so however old that is, I don't know,
Hmm.
but and my dad, I think I had a cold or I wasn't well, and he used the back of the Tiger Balm cap
Hmm.
to do the scraping.
Hmm.
And then I went to school and my mom got a phone call and they said, if we didn't know your family, we would be calling child services for child abuse or something because her back, like you could see it, even with the
Yeah.
t-shirt on. And then they looked at me and they were super concerned. So we've come a long way, I think, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on, my short story there? And like, would that still happen, you think, today in a school with a kid if they kind of saw that? Or they'd be like, oh, Phelps as an Olympian, we see those cupping marks, right? So
I
everyone
was
knows
just
what
getting
that
ready to
is
bring up his
now,
name. Yep.
right? And so it's so changed. I don't know, but are we still kind of in a little bit of ignorance with understanding more about traditional Chinese medicine?
I think the public in general, I mean, there are some people in the public in general that have gained a little bit more familiarity. I mean, thanks to Michael Phelps, like exactly who I was thinking of, in his prep for the games, showed up with cupping marks, and then more and more athletes these days are doing the same thing. Even celebrities sometimes showing up on the red carpet in a backless dress with cupping marks, stuff like that on there. So like I think the public in general is getting more educated. However, as a whole, there are a lot of people who have no idea what that is.
Yeah.
And so maybe maybe some folks who are a little bit more in the know or who follow these sorts of things, these sorts of developments a little bit more, and certainly some people in the healthcare space are a little bit more dialed in or a little bit more open-minded about these things. But I
Mhm.
think the public in general still has quite a long ways to go. I'm quite sure that they're going to be, even this coming school year, there are going to be parents or getting phone calls from school administrators going like, what is this all about?
Mhm.
And cupping is one of these things these days that I mean, I for one was really happy to see Rock Tape come out with the not plastic but or rubber, but I'm not
Silicone?
exactly
Yeah.
silicone. That's it.
Yeah.
The silicone cups. I mean, granted, the suction on those isn't necessarily at the same level as like a hard
Glass.
cup
Yeah.
or the Korean style ones that actually have the vacuum tube to amplify the suction. But those things are legit. I mean, we have a set of them, two sets of them here in the house. And so like when my kids are feeling like they've overtrained or they're coming down with something, they know to use it and they know how to use it. So and it's just great for me because when I'm overtrained or I'm a little tired or whatever like that, or I'm feeling like I need that kind of like fascial kind of lubrication for lack of a better term, they know how to take care of me. So I think the more the public in general is able to widen its arsenal of self-care,
Mhm.
um, understanding as well as self-care modalities and self-care tools, the better we'll all be.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Not even just, hey, you have to go into the office to go see somebody. Like if you could get someone to teach you who knows what they're doing. I mean, granted, we do want professionals kind of making sure that this is done correctly, but I think something really beneficial with, like you said, those silicone cups, it's kind of hard to cause some major damage, for instance, right? And generally with Eastern medicine, you kind of always feel the same thing where the side effect or the potential for a really high risk of something happening is so much lower than, where you see the pharmaceutical commercial and there's like 800 things that could totally go wrong and that will, and they have to tell you about them. And, Chinese medicine is so different in that way. Can you maybe share for our listeners who really have no idea what cupping is, what's the actual benefit, and then as well as guasha, since we just brought it up, and like kind of what the theory and the principles of those techniques are, just so that they can know as they listen.
Sure. Basically, if you think about the body as a bunch of layers, starting from the skin going all the way down to the bone, all those layers that you've got from skin to bone are tissue. And so sometimes those tissues should be able to slide along each other fluidly, right? Like, and if they're stuck together, then there's going to be extra pull. So, like, if you think about the parts of your car, if you turn the wheel and, like, let's say that the wheels are going forward, and then all of a sudden the doors start moving too, then you've got something a little bit dangerous for lack of a better term.
Hmm.
But like if things are able to operate independently as well as interdependently, depending on context, you've got the best possible scenario. So tissues should be able to sometimes work in symphony and sometimes work independently. When you've got stuff that's adhesed, that's stuck, that's not playing in symphony. Sometimes being able to add a stimulus, whether that stimulus is external as far as finger pressure or manual pressure, or sometimes the reverse of pressure, which is a vacuum, right? Like pulling something away or traction. That can then aid the better functionality of the body, of those tissues. So what cupping essentially does is it uses like a cup. Back in the day, people would use actually segments of bamboo and then smooth out that segment of bamboo, put a small piece of lit paper in the very back of the cup, and then invert it. And then what would happen is the lack of oxygen would extinguish the flame, but as the flame was burning out, it would burn off any oxygen and create and as it cooled off, it would create a pressure vacuum. So it would pull the tissue away from the body a little bit, like a suction cup. And so what happens in that particular situation is that it's sort of pulling creating a pressure differential. So in that area where you're being cupped, whereas like most of the other tissue surrounding it is kind of, let's say, normal, or what the body considers normal, it's getting the reverse of pressure or negative pressure where the cup is. So
Mm.
in geek speak, that's kind of what's going on. Um, Coining or guasha or scraping is similar. The Vietnamese have it. I've seen reference to it throughout many different East Asian and Southeast Asian cultures, and it's superb. Actually, the first time I had it, similar to you, I had a wicked cold. I don't know if we ever talked about this.
Don't
Um,
remember.
I had a wicked cold. This was in college, and I remember I had a sore throat that just like it felt like as I'm breathing, never mind swallowing, just as I'm breathing, it felt like sewing needles in my throat.
Ooh.
It was gnarly. Um, and I remember I was just utterly miserable. It hurt to breathe. I had no voice, couldn't sleep. Um, and it was just beside myself for days.
Yeah.
And the girl I was dating at the time said, "You should let my dad do this thing, this scraping." And he comes out with like, the Asian style or the East Asian style soup spoons.
Uh-huh.
He came out with one of those. It was metal.
Oh,
The edges were smooth, totally smooth. So it wasn't
right.
like your average, like random, like shitty edged, whatever.
Right,
It was
right.
beautiful, pristine. Uh, Puts some oil, like one of those like kind of mentholated oils on my back.
Mhm.
And okay, I'm thinking, okay, this feels good. And then when he starts scraping, I'm like, ooh, this does not feel good. And then I listened to my girlfriend at the time. She's going, okay, yeah, just relax. It'll be okay. And then her voice changed. She's like, ooh. And I'm like, what? And she goes, you're bad. And I'm like, I have no idea what she's talking about. After her dad was done scraping my back, um, her she had me turn around and face the mirror, and like had her brother bring another mirror so I could see it because
Yeah,
this was in the days pre-camera phones.
of course.
Um, and it literally looked like, instead of like gentle petechiae or bruising, right? It looked
Mhm.
literally like black tiger stripes. I mean,
Oh,
black.
yeah.
So according to the Chinese medicine theory, it's that darkened because there's been stagnant blood in those channels. So when her dad did the scraping, it actually moved that blood out of the channels. Now, according to Chinese medical theory, we say that when there's a lack of qi flow, or when the body's attacked by an external pathogen, such as wind, like thus wind exposure, right? The
Mhm.
body, when it's attacked by wind, sometimes the channels will close down or get stuck in like a self-protective mechanism. The problem with that is when they're stuck, there's no flow of energy or no flow of blood. So when he was doing that coining, he's actually literally forcing the channels open and then pulling that stale blood out of the capillary beds. I can tell you with 100% certainty that maybe 4 hours or something like that after he coined me, I felt like a dramatic reduction in terms of pain in my throat. I could breathe much
Yeah.
easier. I didn't feel like I had the same kind of cough. Um, so yeah, I mean that was really eye-opening, because at the time when I was experiencing it, I was like, this is some like backwater Vietnamese angry bullshit that's going on in my back, and
He's like,
I
"Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah,
not
you're
having
dating
it.
my daughter. Let me just, come over here, I'll help you."
Yeah, I mean, like I thought that was kind of what was going on, but after experiencing it firsthand,
Yeah. Wow.
seeing like I was totally shocked to see, literally, like I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna see red and bruising, and it was, I kid you not, like black, like my
Yeah.
shirt.
That makes sense. Oh my gosh. Well, I don't remember what my back looked like when I was in kindergarten, but not very good if, they wanted to call Child Protective Services. So, but there is something really interesting about it. And now, answer me this, because you mentioned wind and those concepts. I'd love for you to kind of expand, because there was a really long time, and then there's a lot of Chinese people that are always like, no, 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 you can't get your head wet, don't get in the rain, don't put the fan on at night because you're going to catch like the wind and the cold. But there are concepts that kind of discuss that. But then what are the myths to it, or where is there validity to that? And so forever I was like, no, we will suffer in heat. We will not sleep with any fans on because I will get sick, right? And now I have to kind of sometimes sleep with the fans on, depending on, where I'm at, like hormonally, right? And so
Right.
yeah, so it's just kind of interesting though, because it really is ingrained in your brain when your dad and your mom's like, no, no fan, and make sure you cover your head, don't get your head wet, and all these different things. So, because you mentioned wind, and I was like, I'm going to ask Mark about this.
Yeah, I think a lot of these things really have and really require an understanding of context. Like,
Ah.
wow, some of these ideas in Chinese medicine don't have the smoothest translation into Western speak, but if we understand the mechanisms, it's like looking at two totally different paradigms. Like, um, if we look at how wind manifests in Chinese medicine, it can manifest as tremors, right? Like, so, like, shaking, shivering.
Mm.
Uh, it can manifest as closing of the pores. It can manifest as pain. It can manifest as gosh, I mean, usually wind in terms of as an external pathogen is coupled with cold or heat as well. So wind cold would manifest one way. Wind heat would be more like, like I mentioned earlier with that like crazy sore throat. And heat pathogens tend to also look more like bacterial infections.
Mm.
So they're using a particular old school terminology or a terminology that they could use at the time to describe things that we describe differently in modern biomedicine. But the effects of the body, there's still a logic. There's still both sets of logic still work, just like two different languages would describe something with different words. Um, but yeah, there's like, for example, the sleeping with your hair wet thing. As we know, during sleep, the body tends to, over time, relax, and also metabolic processes slow down. Because they're slowing down, the body temperature tends to drop a little bit more. So if you've got cold, wet hair and there's like a gentle breeze going on, what happens is the scalp starts to contract. The muscles of the scalp start to contract. The same thing with the neck. So now when you've got contracture in those areas, what happens is there's also less blood flow. When there's less
Mm.
blood flow, there's going to be tension. Where there's tension, there's going to be less lymphatic flow, yada, yada, yada. So
Oh,
you can,
I love that you shared that, because people tell me they sleep with their hair wet. And I'm like, oh, no, really? I can't even imagine, like long hair. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. But now at least I understand why that was, like, because there's no explanation from my parents on why. It's just like,
sure,
don't do this. And
sure. And,
so,
and, and it makes sense
but that
because, like,
makes
if you,
sense.
yeah, I mean, but also two different people have different constitutions, right?
Of
Like
course. Of course.
someone, let's say, who eats a lot of like food that tends towards a higher metabolism. Like, for example, we all know that people tend to have who tend to eat a lot of meat, a lot of red meat, when they go to sleep, may experience what's called meat sweats.
Yeah.
If you've never had meat sweats, go to a Korean barbecue place, eat till you can't breathe anymore, and
Yeah.
then see how you sleep that night. Most folks whom I know would be like, I'm lying there, and it's like I'm trying to fall asleep because I'm in food coma. I
Yeah.
can't because my stomach is full, and then like I'm there sweating because now my body's trying to burn off every or break down everything that I just ate.
Yeah.
So in that digestion process, there's a lot of heat. Now, if you didn't eat super rich food and like let's say the average person who's just trying to get by in ancient China didn't have that kind of access to that much meat, rarely ever ate that much meat, didn't eat super high calorie foods, especially like coming from a society where like the greeting is have you eaten yet,
Hmm.
um and is worried more about famine, then the idea of going to bed with your hair wet is super dangerous because metabolically you're not revving at that same level. On the other hand, for someone in the West who like maybe had, I don't know, like a 12-ounce filet mignon with super buttered and cheesed potatoes,
Hmm.
a few hours before going to bed, if their body runs a little bit hotter and they went to bed with their hair wet, it may not be an issue.
Wow.
So
Okay.
context is super important here that way. So like
Yeah.
understanding how society and culture shapes health and how certain things that we get taught, passed down as like, the old wives' tale or not.
Right.
I think really context really decides whether or not there's legitimacy.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because you hear these things and you just blindly either follow or are a non-believer, and then you're like, "Oh, but my neck aches," or whatever from whatever reasons. And so that's fascinating. And I know that we've talked on some of those things before because I'm always kind of looking for validation for any of my superstitions or any of my habits and things that I'm doing selfishly. But it's funny, when we were talking about wind also, I was thinking back to a month I spent in China when I was in Beijing and I was training. I really just did a lot of qigong, and one of those things is my master, she made me stand in front of a tree outside in a, zhangzhang in a position.
Hmm.
And I remember just speaking to you not a couple weeks ago about your incredibly insane Shota contest, where you have to be in a stance for an hour. And I thought that was so unreasonable. And then I was like, actually, now I think back, I remember having to stand outside in front of this tree in this stance. And except for the day it was windy, and she goes, "No, we cannot go outside today because we can't stand in front of the tree and do qigong because it's windy, it's not good." She didn't explain why, but I was actually really grateful it was windy because, that training was rough.
Right, right.
But I guess there's something too about, like, the energy that you're creating and taking in, and then having that wind is disruptive and for your chi, but also, yeah, she didn't really explain it in a way of which how you've explained some of these pieces, but um it just made me think about these two things that have to do with you, which is the Chinese medicine, but also the thought of you doing this training. Do you want to talk about your crazy test that you were prepping for?
Okay.
Well, just even the process of training for something that's physically so demanding, right?
So I'm actually thinking back on your what you just described as far as your qigong training in Beijing.
Yeah,
Like if if I'm picturing it correctly, the most common zanzhuang stance is usually a little bit higher. It's not a super deep like southern
correct,
style kung
correct.
fu horse stance, right?
Yes.
So in terms of that metabolically, right, there's not that much demand compared to like let's say if you were in the Walam horse, right?
Right.
So now let's say it's a little windy that day, or even reasonably windy that day, as long as it's not like freaking brass monkey kind of cold. Like, and you're training outside doing a horse stance. Now, if you were doing the Walam horse out there, holding that for an obscenely long amount of time, I'm willing to bet that even if it were a little chillier or a little windier, you would have been okay. And probably the seafood that you were training with would have been like, yeah, sure, whatever. You're training hard, go for it.
Okay.
Um, so again, a lot of it I think really has a requirement of understanding like or that's incumbent upon the master or the instructor to really
Mhm.
be able to go like, okay, this is the temperature right now, and this is the level of exertion that you're going to be facing. Like if you're just kind of standing there in a nonchalant, not super taxing posture, and let's say it's cold or drizzly or something like that, yeah, that probably isn't the best for building your chi, and it will probably
Mhm.
deplete your chi or deplete your energy. But if you're doing something that's a little bit more taxing, not necessarily vigorous in terms of like, burpees or something like that, but something taxing, like holding a low isometric stance
Yeah.
for a long amount of time, working through muscle fatigue, trying to hold posture. And even though there may be no external load other than your own body holding those postures, you're gonna be if on a quiet day or if you were training inside in a gym, you'd be sweating buckets.
Yes.
So having a gentle cooling breeze on a day like that is awesome. So
Mm.
I'm gonna use that to segue into the Shotokan thing that I just had the privilege of doing. Um, for your listeners that aren't familiar with Shotokan, it's one of the kind of trademark styles of Japanese karate. I had the privilege of studying with one of the earliest pioneers of Shotokan, a master named Tsutomu Oshima, when I first came to California. By that time, he'd already retired pretty much from teaching white belts, and Caltech Dojo was the only place that he was still teaching white belts, and that's where I had the privilege of training with him for a little over a year. Uh, Whenever he would talk about the process of development in his curriculum, he would talk about making a special training. So special training, there's one in winter and one in summer. The summer one is usually 3.5 days. You check in on a Wednesday evening. It goes Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then there's a morning workout on Sunday or morning training on Sunday, and usually testing to follow after that. And so that's the only time in the year that they do black belt testing. I uh, currently hold the rank of EQ, first Q, so it's the highest of the brown belts prior to black belt. And what I had in mind was to try to for years I've been thinking of doing special training, just never got around to it. Life got in the way in a zillion different ways, zillion different times. But this year I was like, okay. And actually last year I'd signed up for it and caught COVID the Monday right as we were supposed to start training. So like,
Yeah.
or that week on that Wednesday, and that shattered me. Um, so this year I was going to try and pick up where I left off, and do that 3.5 day training, and then hopefully the black belt test at the end of it. Just because it's kind of like what I think of as unfinished business, and out of respect and admiration for Oshima Sensei. So one of the work like every day, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you wake up at 4:45 and are out on the field running by like 5:15, and everything's barefoot. Luckily for me this year, one, it was total June gloom rather. And like the instead of the sun beating down and roasting us all day long, we were able to train in like relatively comfortable conditions. So like, and all the running was done. There's a small segment of blacktop, which wasn't too bad, but most of the running was done on a soccer field. So like a huge soccer field. So it was just running and running and running, mile and a half barefoot as a warm
Yeah.
up.
Right. And so everybody, all my listeners know, and that I don't want to run ever again if I have to. And so just the thought of this, and how did you kind of work your way up? Because I know you do a lot of things barefoot because you do strength training, you do all these other martial arts. So you're a little bit more accustomed to doing anything in barefoot. But even so, running outside barefoot, I think there is a certain level of, I mean, you gotta get the hobbit feet, right? Like, how do you just basically train over time for that and be in the environment that you're gonna replicate? And, how long does something like that take?
The smartest process would be to do exactly what you just described. I mean, just a slow acclimation, and so that the tissue builds up some strength, and you actually have some time to build up your calluses. Um, I really didn't do a whole lot barefoot other than just trying to be around the house. Like anytime
Mhm.
I'm in the house, barefoot. Doing my own training whenever possible, barefoot. But compared to some other folks who train and run with some regularity barefoot, compared to them, I felt like, man, I'm really gambling. Um, I'll tell your listeners a story. When I was in college and I'd been training Shotokan for a little bit, but also just done a little bit of done some other training as well, and was kind of building up nice calluses on my feet. I mean, the calluses on my feet were strong enough and thick enough and durable enough to where like I didn't worry about them peeling off. I didn't worry about them like being torn off, and they were thick enough to where like I could put out a cigarette on them. Yeah, just some wild times. But
Yeah, you just gave me a huge visual right there.
yeah, when you can do that and do it comfortably, your calluses are very secure. Um, but I don't have those feet anymore. Um, so luckily now, I mean, my feet were able to tolerate. I think this is part of what kind of, in some ways, had me psyched out a little bit going into the event. Um, I'd heard of people, who'd trained at this particular location before, and guys who I think are way tougher than me. And they were like, "Oh yeah, man, after the first day, my feet were just shredded. Like there's one patch of whatever that we were doing, I can't remember what the drill was, and like, yeah, man, my feet were bleeding after that. And then thank God for like, what is it, liquid skin that
Oh,
you
yeah,
can spray
yeah.
on that
The
covers that.
adhesive, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm listening to all this shit going like, oof, man, like I just, you know, for as much work as I do professionally on my feet with my patients or with my clients, and I'm thinking like, dude, I do not, and I don't want to go through 3.5 days where on day one after the first run my feet are bleeding. I'm like, just why?
No. Yes.
Um, so yeah, that took some acceptance.
I mean, I think that's kind of like the SFG snatch test on day one where people just rip their hand open, right?
Right,
And then
right,
they
right.
have to
Which
train the
I'm
rest of the few days with like torn up hands or whatever with the kettlebells.
right, which is why I'm super glad that Strong First actually flipped that around to the point where like they and I thought and I laud the leadership for this, for them making sure that you have to pass the technique test first for
Mm,
Strong First, right? So if you're not able to do 5 snatches left hand right hand consistently with good form and technique, then any attempt at the snatch test is
yeah,
reckless and dangerous.
exactly.
So it's like uh, there we've never, at least in my experience, I've never seen anyone fail the snatch technique test and have a great snatch test where they have to do 100 snatches in five
Yeah, it
minutes.
doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Can you talk a little bit about calluses real quick? Because in my mind and in most people's minds, the thing is like, no, we don't want to have calluses. Calluses are bad, but it seems like it'd be very beneficial for some of these things. And it's okay sometimes. I guess like weightlifters develop kind of that, you know, hardened skin or whatever. And that's exactly what it is, right? It's just basically like hardening of the
Yeah,
flesh.
so if you think about the body as an adaptive system, what happens is
Okay.
that like if you put a stimulus into the body in a certain way, the body has to figure out, how do I adapt to this so I don't get hurt, or
Mm,
so that I can keep doing this and not risk some sort of injury or some sort of like
okay.
stoppage. So if you look at people that use their hands a lot, like mechanics, like the amounts of force they put on certain of the tissues
Mm,
because of the nature of their tool, or chefs or cooks, right? If they're like constantly stirring or something like that, where the implements contact the hand, that rubbing, that friction, that stimulus um, creates a message to the cells there to thicken, to harden.
mm,
And same thing with hypertrophy in terms of our muscles. We use our muscles and then they grow bigger. Similarly, as we put stressors or gentle stressors into the skin, they thicken. Now, past a certain point, that thickening can become limiting or you know
mm.
uh, brittle, which
Ah,
is why you'll see sometimes cases where like you'll see calluses that look like they impede movement. But by
ah,
and large, callousing is a good thing as long as it's not to the point where like it's cracking or fissuring. Like you'll
okay.
see like oftentimes heels,
Oh,
the
yeah.
people's heels, will
Yeah.
crack, and then as those calluses crack, then you risk infection and things like that. That's a totally different
Ah.
ball of wax.
Yes, yes. Well, because, you want the baby soft hands, and so it's like, "No, we don't want calluses, keep lotioning," but in terms of the resistance to, like you said, your tools and all of that, it makes a lot of sense, but I guess it's more of
Sure.
a
So
a
like if
preference
you have
too on how
so
you
like
feel.
check this out. If you had a competitor who was, let's say, training with the gib or
Mhm,
the do, xiong do, like the double broadsword, right?
mhm.
And that competitor is really putting in hours of practice with a traditional weight weapon, right? Like I'm not knocking anyone else, but with a traditional
Of
weight
course, of
weapon,
course.
and you're putting in reps, I
Yeah,
guarantee you're going to have some callousing in those areas where you're putting in those reps
that's
because
true.
that's a friction to the skin.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
that makes sense. Nope, you're right. And that's why I used to be super embarrassed. But, especially after kettlebell training, I was like, oh, okay, but it does help because you don't want your skin to tear, right? So that you do need to have kind of built up that resistance. Okay. And
yes,
so talking more about like something that's so physical as doing this run and then sitting in a horse stance for an hour and then just sparring and doing all these physical things. Is it and I love asking runners who do marathons and all these other extreme athletes. And is it more mental or physical for you?
Okay, so like you, I freaking hate running. Like I have said that for decades. Like I just don't like it. I've
Yeah.
never really enjoyed it. I think the last time I kind of enjoyed it was in high school as a junior or something like that. Um, and that was just more just because like I was able to zone out and I was running with people and then like it was a kind of social thing. But
Mm,
running on my own, dude, I'd rather either jump rope or do swings or something else. Like
mm,
I just
mhm.
I have no love for running. So for me, running barefoot or running at all is very much a mental thing. And so I was really surprised that running barefoot. I mean, one, again, like I said, we were lucky. I was really lucky because for that particular special training that we just did, that in Japanese they call it gashuku, which is kind of like dorming together because everyone that does this, everyone that partakes in this sort of event is supposed to experience the same conditions. So we just had ours at the Cal State University Channel Islands. And so everyone was dorming together and then, get up, do your thing. So it's not
Yeah.
like someone goes to the Four Seasons and then someone else is going to,
That would be me. That's where I would be sitting.
but yeah, like for me, it was very much mental. But on the other hand, because you've got so many other people with you who are going through the same thing, there's something about the energy of having a lot of people undergoing the same thing
Mm,
that brings out of you stuff that you ordinarily wouldn't do. Like if you asked me on a normal day, hey, Doc, go run barefoot like for a mile, mile and a half, um, and keep up a different decent pace. Don't slow down, don't walk, don't whatever. I'd be like, man, you can kiss my yellow ass. Um, and for whatever reason, the 4 days of it, like I kept up a good pace, kept up the running, and and actually got into a good groove with it.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, it was I think there's a lot of it that's very mental and it's just deciding like, oh man, I feel tired. Oh man, I'm breathing. Allowing these distracting thoughts or these negatives into your mind and then fixating on them, right?
Mm,
And if you can take that energy or take that awareness and just divert it to something else and really fixate on that, oftentimes the time that you spend fixating on something else, on the positive, will carry you through. So for me, like I kept thinking like, okay, that person right in front of me, I'm gonna overtake them. I'm just gonna overtake them. So that would be my goal. So as I'm running, I'm thinking like, okay, I'm gonna overtake that person. And so it's just like it kept me moving forward throughout the entirety of the run. And then when the leader of the event would say, okay, walk, and I'd be like, wow, okay, already we're done the run.
yeah.
Uh, so that helped quite a lot. As far as the horse stance, um, it's interesting. They have three time segments that you can do it in, depending on your age. So I think it's under 40, 90 minutes. Over 40, 1 hour. Over 60, I think it's 45 minutes. Um, so I'm in the 1 hour
Yeah,
category.
that is no joke. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but the Shotokan horse stance isn't quite as deep as like the Southern Chinese say ping ma. So
Anything in an hour though, just in a stance is really tough. Because even when we do
it
like Chen Tai Chi practice, it's not as low, but you're doing it. My mom can hold that thing forever, and Oscar and I are like, okay, let's move it along. It's intense.
yeah, I mean I think I really think that that's a practice that has been so maligned over the years. Like a lot of people talk about horse stances like vestigial, some bullshit that like they were put through just as a gut check by
Mm,
some mean master. And looking at it from a biomechanics standpoint, um, really looking at it from a biomechanics standpoint in terms of strength and conditioning, but also in terms of rehab,
okay.
I appreciate it on a whole new level now. A
Really?
lot of yeah, oh, this is like I really want to have this convo with you about this, like off air.
Okay.
But I think not really, like, I think there's so much value in it that people, I mean, even experienced martial artists or higher level martial artists don't necessarily appreciate as fully as they could if they understood
Hmm.
the mechanisms of why it's so valuable. Like if you look at people these days in terms of like what they might encounter with the FMS, functional movement screen.
Hmm.
One of the things in the functional movement screen is a check of ankle mobility,
Yeah.
specifically ankle dorsiflexion, right? Closed chain ankle dorsiflexion. So if your foot is flat, can you keep your foot flat and bend your knee forward? And like, how far past your toes can your knees go, or can your knee go if your foot is still like completely flat on the floor? Now, most people in the modern world wear shoes with a slight heel lift, right? So we're already in a bit of plantar flexion, not dorsiflexion. And then over time, like most people's feet will tend to go a little bit more and more and more and more towards plantar flexion.
Mm.
The problem with that is like we now have dorsiflexion restrictions. So being able to do a like a horse stance, and it doesn't necessarily need to be as severe as a Southern Chinese
Right.
horse, but like even something that is like a relatively shallow, like uh, more modern style taekwondo horse stance, where the knees are bent in the direction of the toes,
Hmm.
maybe just over the toes, if not slightly behind, allowing your calf muscles, specifically the soleus, to be able to stretch and get strong and have endurance in that position is an insurance policy for the knees, for the ankles, for even the hips. So like these are things that I think like if old time martial artists, old school Asian doctors, whatever, knew how to communicate the benefits of these practices and contextualize them for a modern audience, they would have such wicked buy-in. The problem is that a lot of people don't speak East West. So
Right.
I think this is part of the reason why like it's incumbent upon guys like me, guys in my generation or our generation or younger, to be able to say like this is why we do this stuff and it has value, um, and be able to explain solidly with biomed speak this is when and why and for whom it has value.
Yeah. No, I love all this. And I think in some way we touch on this every time, but in a different exercise pattern or something that we're always talking about. And it makes so much sense because it goes back to even the beginning of our conversation, which is my dad telling me, let me do this thing, or don't sleep with your hair wet, or, like context and everything, but never really explaining why and just having to have blind faith. And not that we shouldn't question and just follow blindly. Like obviously there's a respect and there's a tradition and we honor those things, of course, too. But it is helpful for the brain to process it in, wow, no, this is really beneficial because doing these skills will help me not fall when I'm older. I'll be more balanced when I'm, all these different things that we're doing. If we can kind of relate that for people in a real life setting, like you said, the buy-in is there, not just because it's part of the style and the tradition. And some people are fine with that, but I think a lot of people love having that connectivity because the light bulb goes off and it's not just I'm doing this thing. It's wow, no, this is going to be really beneficial for me and good for me. So I really love and appreciate that you can explain those things to me because I feel like a lot of that has definitely been missing in my vocabulary in the first half of my teaching career. And I'm grateful for, you, but like even Oscar, who took it upon himself to really try to learn from your caliber of instruction, Brett Jones, all these FMS, all the speak, like you say, and try to connect those dots. Like that's one of the biggest things I think he's been focusing on because he also comes from a space where he couldn't always do a squat. So he had to figure out how and why and then be able to teach
Mhm.
that. So he teaches it way better than I do because I was like, well, I don't know, we've been squatting since we never stopped, right? And so it's just the ability to explain that I think is so key. And I know a lot of times that you and I kind of talk off air, we talk about how you are a teacher in so many different spaces across martial art styles, across strength and conditioning and all these different fitness and exercise science, but you don't have like a formal school. So you get to just like absorb all the info and then decide who you want to share it with and who's fortunate. So I'm very glad that I get to benefit from this because I always feel like as a teacher, it's just like you're constantly just giving, 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 and you always forget to kind of take in information. So I always respect the fact that you're able to do that, but then you also share it too, even though you don't have to because you don't formally have like a obligation on a daily basis, except for the fact that you're a parent, and so therefore you are 24/7 being obligated to share and give, and give. But yeah, it's fascinating. I love that we can brainstorm that.
I think as a clinician, though, like as a doctor, as someone that
That's
has to be
true.
responsible for patients, like if you mentioned the word buy-in, and I think that's clutch. Like if you want people to make lifestyle modifications, they've got to know
Yeah.
why. Because like the average Westerner these days, if you tell, never mind Westerner, anyone, pretty much the average person that lives in the modern world, you tell them to do something and you don't give them a why, the likelihood of them being compliant just plummets. So if you can explain why things are happening to them and why a particular intervention will work, and it's clear and it's compelling, and they can really wrap their brain around, okay, these are the things that I did that got me to this point where I'm not happy or I'm not healthy. And these are the things that I need to do that will address all of these things and take me in a comfortable, logical way towards my goal of being able to move better, feel better, live better, whatever, fill in the blank. Then you're going to get better compliance. And so I think for us, because we have the luxury of living in a world, in a society where like we're not fleeing immediate war right now, right?
Mm,
So because we're not in, let's say, refugee mode, right, where we have to
yeah.
flee a war, or flee a famine, or run for our lives, or have to fight daily in like fight violence literally, um, physically on a day-to-day basis. There's uh, a different kind of attitude around things. So like we have the luxury of asking, well, why? Um, Rather than like, hey, just do this, your life depends on it.
Right.
So, you know, back in the day, yeah, I think a lot of Sifu, a lot of teachers, a lot of experts in subject matters would be able to say like, yeah, just do this, because like for you to even hear input from them at all was a blessing. These
Yes.
days, it's quite the opposite. Like there are people out there putting stuff on YouTube, like masters, like older masters who are putting stuff on YouTube that prior to the spread, the proliferation of the net, they were like, I'll never share this, I'll never share that, but this is my secret of my style. And then now they realize that those same things that they were holding close to the vest, some of them actually, to be able to let them out, allow them to differentiate and now are selling points. So, context is way different. So for
Hmm.
us, for the younger generations coming up under us, we've got to be able to explain well. We've got to be able to help them
Yeah.
understand.
As a doctor and you're always working with different patients, so listeners have a concept and idea. Not only do you do traditional Chinese medicine, but you also do a lot of physical training for them too, through all of your million and gajillion certifications and things that you know, and all of the techniques that you have. But is there an exercise that you usually give them a buy-in where you explain and then the light bulb goes off? But is there a resistant exercise or physical patterning that people never want to do until you go, well, if you do this, then this happens? Is there like kind of that constant, oh, aha, because for Kung Fu, we're
Mm.
always doing the same thing. Like we're doing the same basics, the same stuff, but there's always moves, I feel like, and I would have to get Oscar here that he's like, clients just hate doing this, and then you have to explain why it's so important. Is there anything like that comes to your mind that's like kind of common where no one ever wants to do it until you explain why?
Hmm. All right, I'm gonna flip this around and go like, okay, so Mimi, tell me this. In Kung Fu class, is there an
Yes.
exercise that comes to mind like, this is at the top of the list?
Yes.
Like, what
Iron
would that be?
bridge.
Iron Bridge is like a
Yeah,
back.
back bend. Yeah, people
Okay,
hate that. One is they hate being upside down, and most of them don't have the T-spine mobility or the wrist
shoulder
mobility
mobility,
or the
right?
shoulder mobility. Like there's something that will always stop them. But then there's the the jerk off 16-year-old that just like goes straight back or did gymnastics. And like we got one girl one time that came into class and she was in a gymnastics class and she went back so fast, we thought she was for sure gonna just smash her head on the ground.
Oh
That's
my
how
God!
fast it was
Wow.
like a back handspring fast, but just like in a perfect bridge, like practically like a contortionist. And we're like, oh my God. So I think that move frustrates people because they'll see only the one person in class that can do it, not that everyone else is struggling too. And it makes them feel so like inadequate. And then we have a lot of people that,
Frustrating,
okay,
right?
I'm just gonna do a cobra stretch instead. I can't do that. And they'll kind of give themselves reasons they can't do that ever. So they'll just substitute the exercise. And we kind of push them to try to do it. But it also depends. Like even if it's just a high hip bridge or something, like there's progressions to it. But kids don't like it, adults don't like it. I even have kids these days that's like, I don't want to lay on the ground. And I'm like, what? Get on the ground.
Yeah,
They don't want to
yeah.
get dirty. But yeah, but Iron Bridge, like the back bend, people hate doing that.
So I'm guilty of that. Like I don't, and honestly, like I have a friend who's called me out. She's all like, "So did you do your bridge?" And I'm like, "Ah, shit." Um,
Yet another thing for me to text Mark Cheng about.
yeah, absolutely. Go right ahead. Like for me, I'm one of these guys that's like,
I
if
won't
you,
do
if
that. I won't do that. Nothing
I
physical because you could call me out on so many things.
no,
So
but do it because like if you can call me out on it and it's something that like a healthy athlete should be able to do,
right, right.
then why the hell not? Right? Like
Hmm, hmm.
and it's good. Go ahead and dangle that carrot because then it'll it'll push me to grow. It'll push me to improve.
Yeah,
It'll push me towards ranges of motion that are going to improve my health. They're going to
right.
decrease my likelihood of injury. Like most of us, if you think about the human body as a front and a back, right? Like
Hmm.
the fronts of our body tend to be a little bit more harbor a little bit more muscle tone. Those muscles tend to be a little bit tighter, especially around the hips. Now, our backs tend to be a little bit weaker. So those muscles tend to not be able to contract as much. Therefore, you have people that like, we have the entire skinny jean culture now, like people who don't have glutes. So because they don't have necessarily that same musculature as a society, um, fashion trends change too. So like if you actually have strong enough glutes, then extending your hips shouldn't be an issue, shouldn't be a problem.
Mm.
But
Oh,
if you have a rigid T-spine, like you mentioned, if you have um, a forward protruding neck, like a lot of people these days they talk about Texter's neck. So
oh,
like if you have Texter's neck, to put your head and neck in neutral position and then lean back as you
yeah.
need to for a bridge
Pain. Yeah,
is freaking hard. Now, the
yeah,
more pain and the more tension there is in the neck, the more you will shut off strength in the arms. So that's a super important consideration. So, like being able to give people the right, or I shouldn't say the right, but like achievable stepping stones. So, placing the stepping
yes,
stones in progression
definitely.
close enough so that they can do that is clutch. Um, and then just incentivizing it to, get people to be able to do that.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, like my daughter is wonderful about that. She's like, "Here, Dada, because you're old and fat, let me give you this Swiss ball." She's merciless in terms of roasting me. So she'll get me an exercise ball, and that takes off a lot of the load for me to be in that bridge position, but it
Hmm.
allows the hypertonic part of my front to open up,
Right.
so that I can then engage the other muscles in the back.
Yeah.
So yeah, like at the beginning, she's not like, okay, just drop straight into a bridge. It's like, okay, lie back on this for a little while and do it, especially for your head and neck and shoulders. And so that, like, even lying back on it,
Yeah.
especially for people that are super tense in the front, is taxing. Like you will see some folks, especially people who occupy desk jobs or have very forward flexed postures for the majority of their day, to have them lie on an exercise ball on their
Yeah.
backs and arched open is almost panic attack inducing.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's definitely something very valuable to be able to do. So
Yes.
yeah, as far as exercises for me, Um, I don't know that there are any of my
That you
clientele
get
or any of my
resistance. They
patients.
all just listen to you because they know you know.
I mean, honestly, like
Yeah.
I, full disclosure, I kind of priced myself out of the market. Like
Yeah.
I wanted to be at a point where like if someone doesn't know who I am or um isn't really familiar with what I bring to the table, then instead of wasting my time trying to sell them on why my process
Right, right.
works, like I just nope, later. And that's where I am in terms of my development, in terms of
Right.
my reputation and stuff like that. I've been at this for a quick minute. Um, if now I think if it were 30 years earlier and I'm like fresh out of school and trying to develop a clientele, then that's totally different. But
Yeah.
also like now I'm lucky in the sense that I'm able to enjoy buy-in from people who are already on the waiting list. Now,
Mhm.
for people, if I had to work with someone that didn't know who I was, that didn't know what it was that I do, then it's super important for me to be able to break down every single exercise in a manner that's achievable.
Mhm. Mhm.
So one of the concepts in K3 Combat Movement Systems, which is the system that I co-created with Jimmy Yuan, one of the central concepts is the three kings of programming. I'm sorry, what we call the three kings. And there are two different three kings. There's the three kings of programming, which is a metric we use to decide what you're going to do um, as a client, right? Like how do we select an exercise? So the three kings are: one, is it beneficial? Does it help that you do this thing? And if so, what does it help? Number two, is it challenging? Does it force you to adapt somehow? So if you're able to do something and it's beneficial, but it's not challenging, like, okay, you might be doing it, you might be able to enjoy some benefit from it, but it doesn't really create adaptation. And because it's not really creating adaptation and it's not really challenging you, the brain isn't as involved. When the brain's involved thinking about it, then you have a different level of tissue change, a tissue adaptation. Now, third thing is it fun? Now, if something's not fun, if there isn't some kind of goal attached to it, some kind of feeling of like, oh, that's cool. Like even for me, like running, like just simply the fun of being able to move past someone that was in front of me, right? To me, that was the fun. The act of running, the act of like challenging my lungs to be able to run like that, I just whatever, like it doesn't call me.
Yeah, yeah.
So if it's fun, there's a different kind of emotional buy-in, right? And
Mhm.
so an exercise that you may resent turns into a distress, meaning like your body then reads that exercise or that experience as a stressor, a negative stressor. Whereas eustress, spelled EU and then stress, eustress is a positive um, stressor. So something that creates a positive change. So
Mm.
if I view the same experience, and this is where this has been a big thing of mine, probably for the past 7 years, 6, 7 years or so, right? Just perception, modifying perception and understanding what allows us to modify perception. The same exact experience, if I view it as like, man, this absolutely blows. I don't want to be here. I'm full of resentment. Then my body is going to experience that stress, that input, that stimulus as a negative stressor, as a form of distress, and it'll be a cortisol event for me.
Mm.
Similarly, if I view that same experience as, man, this is good. This is building me up. I'm enjoying this. And like, I'm actually genuinely digging the experience, then I will not have that same kind of bath of stress hormones. And then my body will experience that stimulus differently and benefit from it.
Mm.
So there we go.
Well, that was quite a lot of explanation, and I love it. Especially now, I'm just going to tell people please go to this minute in the Dr. Mark Cheng podcast to understand why you should be doing your bridge, because not just because I said so. Thank you.
Every Wallem student worldwide.
Yes, every Wallum student worldwide, and every gymnast, because I'm sure there's a bunch of kids in gymnastics class, and they're just like, oh, because it's it, it's it's fun, like you said, if everyone's doing it and you know that it leads to these other skills and everything, but it can be pretty rough, especially when you don't do it for a while. So I also should be bridging more. So you and I can bridge together.
I think that should be your next online
My
tutorial.
next online tutorial. Ah, okay.
Yes,
No,
progressions into.
I was looking for a next tutorial actually. So,
I think that's a
wow.
great thing because just
Yeah.
like people are so forward flexed that for them to get into neutral, like simply standing up totally straight, like
Yeah.
a lot of people talk about that as being an extension.
Right.
So I'm like, wow, neutral is the new extension. Okay.
Right.
Wow. Holy.
I feel like I'm
So
always an extension. That's the thing. I'm like the direct opposite. It's, I think from the gymnastics and then from, I feel like I'm too much an extension and I have to work to actually tuck and hold from my core. So that's kind of funny. I'm like the direct opposite when you know.
yeah, I think
Ah,
for me though, for me and I think for the majority of
yeah, most
people
people
who
are
yeah,
not. So
yeah, we're
understood.
anterior chain dominant for sure.
Yes,
So
understood.
to be able to, you know, access those ranges of motion, whether extension or flexion. And the more we can access those and the more we can control those and the more we like don't fear those or get stressed
Yeah.
over those,
Yeah.
then the healthier we are.
100%. 100%. All right, sir. I mean, it goes by so quick when we're chatting, but always nice to have you on the podcast and always nice to see you. So until next time, Dr. Mark Cheng, everyone.
Bye guys.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/Sifu Mimi Chan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.